Okay, from Roman Republic to the Empire. Purposes for reading: identify how and when the Republic fell, identify who the first emperor was and why he was popular, identify how Rome governed the provinces and how this led to the Pax Romana, what made an emperor good or bad, and explain why Rome fell. So this is an overview for you. So as you've learned, Julius Caesar, his death marked the end of the Roman Republic. Now he was very popular, and he was killed literally. He killed literally for attention. This is what got him power. Estimates say that he killed over 1 million people in Gaul when he invaded it with his Roman legions, which he used to build up his publicity, his power. But when he crosses the Rubicon against the Senate's wishes, he does so because he is disregarding the law, and the Senate fears him because he is not on their side. So when he crosses, there's the fear of dictatorship, but it never happens because he doesn't need to. He has all the power. But the people, they're not concerned about it. In fact, they like him. Now, he holds power for roughly 6 years, and he's not a dictator, despite what people say. He's never called himself king, but because of the fear of that, his counterparts in the Senate, including his friends, stab him 23 times. Unfortunately for this means the end of the Republic in Rome, and it actually brings on a dictatorship. So the very thing that those men were trying to stop happens anyways. So the second triumvirate is 3 men who, just like the first triumvirate, kind of work together to hold Rome together and rule. They're not senators, they just have popular power. And they are Octavian, Mark Antony, and a guy named Marcus Lepidus. And over time, what happens is that Octavian, who is Caesar's adopted son, his nephew, he defeats his rivals, essentially Mark Antony. He defeats them in the Battle of Actium, and he's able to take over the empire, and he rules it for a long time. Okay, almost 40 years is what his rule essentially is, 31 BC to 14 AD. In fact, that's 44 years. And he does some things for Rome along the way. And one of the things he does is he takes on the title Augustus, which, as you've heard, means first citizen. Now, the rule of Caesar Augustus, as he's now called, is that very much of the first emperor, though he never says that, he never calls himself that, because he's aware of how the Romans look at the word king. He controls the army, he controls the provincial government, so the government in the provinces, and because of that, he controls Rome. And the people love him because he's strong, he brings peace and order, and he does a lot for Rome itself. He builds or restores many temples. And he doesn't just build them in brick or stone, he does it in marble. He is responsible for creating a police and fire force to help with Rome's now huge population of over 1 million people. So again, that helps with that stability. The provinces are vast. There are 40 provinces, and they go as far north as present-day Britain, south to Spain, North Africa, present-day Turkey, the Middle East, even Egypt. And each one has a governor that is appointed by the emperor. And their job is to keep order, collect taxes, and make sure that they trade with Rome. And they might trade through various different things. Now, this is what's crazy, is that at a peak of Rome's power, the empire contains 60 million people. At the time, historians figure this was about 20% of the world's population. So it was very big. Okay, so this empire was held together usually by strong emperors who encouraged the building of cities, involving them in government, and making them Roman citizens. So these emperors, the good emperors, knew that in order for Rome to survive, they needed other people to buy in. And you did that by giving them say in government, by making them citizens, by building cities, because that held the bonds that mattered. And during Octavian's time, as you can see from the map, he gets what's called the Peace of Rome, because all the conquering has happened. The conquering of the Gauls, Spain, Britain, North Africa, Egypt. This all happens relatively fast, within 100 years of Octavian's rule. And so what happens is that you now have a relative time of peace. There's not a lot of conflict. And this is called the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome. And it'll end with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD. So about 207 years that this peace lasts. And that's really good for Rome because Rome is able to flourish. And if you can look at this map, you can see that the timeline of the Roman Empire is vast. It starts down here at 31 BC when Caesar Augustus takes over, and you can see by the colors different emperors. Now you have what's called the Julio-Claudian dynasty, the Flavian dynasty. These are relatively strong leaders. There's a couple bad ones in there. You got Caligula, but then you've got other good ones up here. You've got Hadrian, Trajan, you have Titus, then you've got other bad ones like Commodus. So there are different leaders in here who do different things, and there's different eras. But notice, right around 286 AD, Rome splits. And it splits because of the strength. You get an Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. The West is still in Rome. The East is now in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, Turkey. And so you have a split empire because things are so hard to rule. And what I will tell you is that the Western Empire collapses first. And it collapses because of really bad leadership. Okay? But notice, for the most part, Constantine is the last Roman ruler. He just splits the empire to make it easier to rule. But over time, the East will go one way, the West will go another. So let's talk about the good emperors. We'll call them first citizens, as they were called. Caesar Augustus is one. Trajan, Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. There were a few others. But what did they do? Well, they kept people safe by having low crime, police forces. They had fire protection because, a lot of people's homes were made of wood, and you got to protect that. You had really good soldiers, and they're not just good to fight, but they're also good to build bridges and roads and canals for water. And these things still stand today. They helped build cities, they helped build monuments, columns, arches to the glory of Rome. So these emperors built up Rome and made people feel proud. The bad emperors, so let's talk about a couple specifically. You got one guy named Caligula. The guy was mentally unstable. He declared himself a god, and tried to get his horse made a senator. You can imagine how that went. He wasn't well liked. It was so bad that his personal bodyguard, the guys who were supposed to protect him, they killed him in 41 AD. He didn't have a long life. Or Nero, let's talk about this guy. He poisoned his stepbrother. He then murdered his own wife. And he tried to kill his mom with poison, but it took a few times because she was, aware of his instability. But this is what Romans had to deal with. Okay? These bad Romans try to trick these bad emperors try to trick Romans into thinking everything is good. How? Well, public entertainment, like reality TV. How about gladiator games or chariot races at the Circus Maximus? This is where we start hearing about gladiators. Yes, they happened before, but not like the scale that we think of when it comes to Rome. All right? And remember the big thing, as we've said, civis Romana sum. That is all about security. You would walk up to somebody and say, civis Romana sum. I am a Roman citizen. And that meant security. That meant you're safe on roads, oceans, and in your homes. You generally didn't have to worry about people hurting you. But as Rome gets weak, the attacks on the borders really hurt. And so you can see by this map, you can see where the Vandals, the Gauls, the Visigoths, how they pushed Roman forces back. Okay? And this, more than anything, impacted trade. An empire is only as good as its trading networks, whether you're trading clothing, food, whether you're trading services, slaves. If you don't have the roads to get these trades in, the ships and shipping lanes to trade, you don't have an empire that's holding it together. And that was a problem because the goods can't get over them without dealing with thieves or enemy armies. So the empire was shrinking. And while Rome was able to once defend itself and expand, now Rome is contracting or restricting, and that's hurting the empire. So security becomes a problem later in the empire. And as I mentioned earlier, the splitting of the empire happens under Emperor Diocletian. In an effort to actually save it, he splits it into the east and west. West is from Rome, east is from Byzantium, then renamed to Constantinople, today's Istanbul. The idea here was to reform the government and really reinstate that security and build up that economy because it had collapsed. Romans were now suddenly finding themselves looking around going, wait, what happened? And there's a lot of reasons for that. The big reason for the collapse is because the army was not Roman anymore. It was Spanish or German or British or Gaul. They were not Roman, so they didn't have any loyalty to Rome. It also had an effect that the Romans needed their food brought to them. Not many Romans actually were farmers anymore. The food had to come in from Egypt and France and Spain. And, well, if they're not going to work, what do the Romans actually do? And that was a problem. So Rome does collapse. And a lot of the emperors who followed Marcus Aurelius, who was a pretty good emperor, are more concerned with their own wealth and power than they were about the good of the empire. And one of the things that became very obvious was the power of the army. Because these guys were not Roman, they weren't necessarily loyal to one city. They were loyal to who would ever be best for them. So they didn't tolerate weak emperors. There was a lot of times of infighting where different groups of the army fought each other. That obviously doesn't help. As I said earlier, Romans refused to serve. They hired mercenaries. Okay, and so when you get attacked by barbarian groups, those are non-Romans we're calling them, that hurt. Until in 410, when a group called the Visigoths, they actually invaded Rome, sacked it, and they pillaged it for 3 days. And what I mean by pillaging is they burned, they murdered, they raped, they stole. They made Rome a place that you didn't want to be. And 45 years later, another rampage is going to occur by another group called the Vandals. So no matter what happens, Rome is done. And that is going to be a problem for the rest of Europe. Because for 1100 years, you've had this Roman power. And now, not so much. But in the East is still there. So that's, it's a good thing, but things get tricky. But the issue now is who fills the gap in Europe? Who is going to be that power that Rome has been for so long? Who provides security? The trade. What about religion? Even though we haven't talked about it, Roman religion was a very important part of the empire. What about war? Who handles the war? So at this point, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there's what's called a vacuum. No one really leads. But we're still in the empire.